The carceral state is a term used to describe the network of police, courts, and prisons that carry out criminal justice policy, which in contemporary America means overseeing the world's largest population of prisoners, parolees, and other citizens whose freedom is limited by law. Though these institutions are of long standing in American history, the concept of the carceral state describes their dramatically expanded reach, power, and cooperation beginning in the late 1960s. But the rise of the carceral state cannot be explained by the simultaneous crime wave that began at the same time and peaked around 1990. At most, this ambient fear of crime secured public support for a series of policy changes that relied on the criminalization of drug use to vastly expand the prison population. The result is a system that imprisons one of every 110 Americans. 25% of the world's prisoners are in the United States, which is home to 5% of the world's population. Whether as prisoners or parolees, 1 in every 50 Americans is under the direct rule of the carceral state. The only other modern society with a comparable number of prisoners is Stalin's post-war Soviet Union, where the Gulag network of labor camps swallowed up criminals, political prisoners, prisoners of war, and other entirely innocent victims of the regime's paranoia. No carceral state operating at this level can exist apart from the society in which it is embedded. Prisoners in America all come from somewhere. They come from families and communities whose own lives are also caught up in a system that is designed to punish and exclude. Because criminal justice in America is defined by the broader social realities of unequal power among races and classes, the carceral state weighs most heavily on already excluded communities, communities in which economic stagnation, racial hierarchy, and enforced poverty have already defined the relationship between state and citizen. Now, for some, the carceral state is practically invisible. Wealthy communities are typically policed in far gentler terms than poor communities, and these communities, which tend to be whiter than the country as a whole, the carceral state's footprint is light. For citizens who rarely interact with police or have experience with the criminal courts, the justice system can be credibly described as neutral and restrained. At the very least, it does not appear as a direct threat. But for citizens in those places where the carceral state's weight is the heaviest, it is often the sum total of experience with government. Consequently, these citizens' image of the state and their relationship to it is shaped by this omnipresent reality. Once again, we're dealing with two different kinds of curriculum, two different ways of educating people into their proper relationship with state power. Some are taught that the justice system exists to empower them. Others are taught that the justice system exists to put them into its power. These divergent forms of socially enforced education have profound implications for democracy, both material and ideological. In material terms, felon disenfranchisement laws mean that millions of Americans who have been convicted of a felony permanently lose their right to vote. In ideological terms, millions more Americans have been taught that the government amounts to a series of traps, whether in the form of petty infractions that rack up fees and fines, mandatory minimums for not just felony but misdemeanor convictions, and direct police violence. Now, this is incompatible with any form of democracy that is genuinely committed to popular participation in government. It is also a fundamental problem for democracies that only claim to rely or want such participation. Of course, depending upon where you are in the United States, democracy may be more or less robust, but it is never quite healthy anywhere. In any case, citizens who experience the state as an outside force that relies on violence to enforce arbitrary rules are not citizens who have any reason to trust the state, or have reason to believe empty talk about empowerment and participation. If we accept the premise that democracy requires citizen participation in forms open to everyone, then we must accept that the present system is generating a legitimacy crisis. We have spent some time discussing this concept of legitimacy, but it is a tricky one to nail down. We might say that political institutions function best when they are believed to be legitimate by the great majority of the population they govern. Citizens have internalized the belief that these institutions act as they do and wield power as they do because they have the right to do so. Legitimacy is established in many ways. The preferred American method is election. We obey the people who have been elected to make and enforce the law because we believe that the majority has the right to pick its rulers. Legitimacy in this sense requires good behavior by the minority. That is, as voters, we are in the majority as often as we're in the minority. When in the minority, political legitimacy is maintained by accepting defeat, accepting the winner's right to rule, and trying again to make a majority in the next election. It is easy to take this kind of legitimacy for granted in the United States, where the peaceful transition of power has until recently been unusually durable. But this kind of legitimacy is hard won. It relies on deep bonds of trust between very different groups of people, sedimented by historical practice and other deeply rooted norms of behavior. But most of the authorities citizens encounter in daily life are not elected. No one voted for the local beat cops, or the prosecutor of your case, or the judge issuing you a sentence, or the parole officer checking up on you. Now, to be sure, people do vote for sheriffs and district attorneys, and in some cases, judges. But these are the individual leaders of often very large institutions. We mostly deal with criminal justice bureaucrats. In the case of the police, bureaucrats authorized to use lethal force. When these agents of the state behave abusively and unfairly, the lesson of state impunity is taught all the more harshly. You can't vote out the local cops or even the police chief. If the legitimacy of institutions declines, if courts are seen as unfair and corrupt, if police are seen as violent bullies, then citizens will likely seek to minimize their interaction with government. After all, if those interactions tend to be harmful, wouldn't you want to make them as infrequent as possible? Democracy becomes impossible under these conditions. Of course, this argument is premised on the idea that democratic participation is a good thing in and of itself, and that participation must be open to all, if it's going to be real for all. But if you take a different view, if you are suspicious of what can come of democratic participation, if you're suspicious of just what kind of people are going to take participation seriously, then there is nothing inherently undesirable about a justice system that teaches its subjects to fear the state, to avoid it as much as possible. A good argument can be made that the fundamental conflict that cuts through every aspect of American politics at the moment is the conflict between the forces seeking to expand democracy and the forces seeking to suppress it. In a struggle about such basic premises of our common life, every institution that shapes our experiences of citizenship is implicated. In 1949, the English sociologist T.H. Marshall gave a lecture that meditated on the evolution of citizenship since the era of the democratic revolutions. The revolutions in the United States, France, Haiti, and elsewhere in the late 18th century came after a century of struggle for what he called civil citizenship. By this, he meant the essential civic right to participate in public life, to speak freely, and to live securely from arbitrary interference or punishment by the state. Revolution dramatically accelerated this trend. As the basic elements of civil citizenship spread, demands for political citizenship increased. After all, what was the good of being free to speak one's mind if that speech could not be converted into action? Political citizenship is what we might think of more commonly as democratic citizenship, the kind of belonging defined by the right to have a say in what the law is. Marshall identified a third kind of citizenship that was coming into being as he spoke: social citizenship. Social citizenship took the next logical step. The free citizen empowered to participate in democracy has a right to social security, freedom from poverty and ill health and ignorance. This was the driving force behind the creation of social democratic welfare states, which took for granted the duty of the government to ensure a decent standard of living for all. Marshall had in mind the Labour Party in Britain, which was then building the National Health Service, and the New Deal in America that created Social Security and the minimum wage, with a more distant echo of the Soviet Union and the revolutionary aims of the socialist movement. This model may help us think through the nature of American citizenship in the context of the carceral state. Most importantly, these rights were never applied or exercised equally. Civil rights in Marshall's sense were widely established among free white Americans from the period of the Revolution. These rights were slowly extended to the excluded, to immigrants, women, and finally the enslaved. But progress is never permanent, and these civil rights have been rolled back and suppressed repeatedly. Political citizenship, in many ways the only kind of citizenship our political culture really acknowledges, has always been more restricted and more decisively shaped by race and class divisions. Indeed, the extension of political citizenship has been at the center of the most bitter struggles in American history. These rights, too, have been frustrated or rolled back. As contemporary elections show, the battle over the equal enforcement of political citizenship and the right to vote is by no means settled. Social citizenship has been more marginal in the United States than in any other industrialized democracy. There are a number of reasons for this, but most important for our purposes is that social citizenship involves giving people access to resources for no other reason than that they are members of society. The American welfare state has never accepted this premise, instead relying on a system of means testing that only gives aid to people who can essentially prove their poverty. This unwillingness to give benefits to the supposedly undeserving is heavily influenced by racial prejudice. For example, just to suffice, when Social Security was passed in 1935 and began paying benefits to retired workers, Southern Democrats insisted on a clause that prevented farm workers and domestic servants from receiving the benefit. That was because in the South, those were jobs done overwhelmingly by black people. Hence, it was unacceptable to grant them benefits paid out of white people's taxes. Historical legacies aside, we should also think about how citizens are evaluated by the carceral state in terms of these different forms of citizenship. Under what conditions are people's civil, political, and social rights respected or ignored by the justice system? How and why are some citizens assumed to have access to all three, or merely one, or none at all?